there are two things, actually, that I think you all have in common. One is this incredible commitment to reforming the system, but you also have shown an incredible ability to build alliances in this work beyond your normal crowds, right? Like, I think we're used to a world now where we can just talk to our friends, whether or not it's in social media or whether it's the people we engage with on a real basis. There is a temptation these days to only talk to our allies. And all three of you have really changed the dynamic in that. I'm going to start with you, Pat, because as Nick pointed out, you really have been a catalyst for criminal justice reform in the conservative community. Tell me how you got there, and tell me why this work is important to you.
Well, I got there because I went to prison, and I had a chance to see the reality versus what I'd been shown as a legislator. I have had a strong interest in prisons. I visited more prisons as a member of the Assembly than any other member. But when I went in as an inmate, I discovered that was all a Potemkin village. You know, the inmates all dressed up in brand new uniforms. They had new coffee machines. They'd planted palm trees at the entrance, and it was all fake. And two things, actually three things, really struck me as the difference. The first is, as a legislator, I thought they talked about all these programs that help prepare inmates to be good neighbors when they got out. I realized that was all false, that there was a smattering of programs, but most inmates never even got near them. The Inspector General just reported that what programs there are, the inmates are assigned to not by the needs of the inmates, but by what staff they have available. So it's for the convenience of the bureaucracy. The second thing I discovered was that faith, which I had assumed would be encouraged, was actually discouraged in prison. Not because of any animus to faith, but prisons are a bureaucracy, and it's more work to involve volunteers coming in. I've said to understand prisons, take a DMV office, string barbed wire around it, and give the clerks guns. And that's their attitude. And so it's not that religious volunteers help prepare inmates to live good lives. It's more work for the guards. Then the last thing, I'll be very quick, but it hits you straight in the face, and that's the racial disparity. There's no way you can spend 15 minutes in a prison without it overwhelming you. And I came out saying, we need to do something about all three of those things.
That's actually a very good segue. Thank you. That's a very good segue to Vanita's work, because when you were named to head the Civil Rights Division in 2014, you'd been at the ACLU, you'd been at the NAACP, LDF, you'd done a lot of work on mass incarceration and racial justice. But by the same token, notwithstanding those sterling progressive credentials, you've got folks like Grover Norquist singing your praises. There are folks at ALEC who sing your praises. I mean, again, you are another example of someone who might be planted in one side of the political aisle, but you've been able to reach out, do your work, and build these alliances. Why don't you tell us how you got here and how you're able to build and cement those relationships as you're doing this work?
You know, the path to it isn't completely linear, because I started out, as you said, at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund as a litigator representing people who are accused of crimes and trying to fight for racial justice in the criminal justice system. And this was in the early 2000s when actually there were a lot of progressive civil rights groups that weren't touching the issue of mass incarceration. You would go to conferences and everything else would be on the agenda, but there would be nothing about what was happening and had happened over the last 30 years in our criminal justice system. And it was groups like Vera and some other groups that were sticking through these issues and actually fighting in the darkest of times when the issue had no popularity or resonance among conservatives or progressives in a reform agenda way. And something started to shift in the course of doing this work when we were kind of a lonely group off in our corner trying to make noise to say, hey, pay attention. And that's when, in kind of mid-2000s, we began to see a shift of what was happening in some of the states. And for me, I mean, I have very strong values that undergird the work that I have been doing in the justice system around racial justice, around the desire and understanding that we have no rule of law if our governance system and our criminal justice system are not seen as legitimate for communities that engage with it. But I started to say that if there are people out there that are coming to this work, they may have different values animating it, but they are, I'm kind of a pragmatic person, and I want to be able to get things done to be able to have justice. I started to work with folks that sometimes there were folks at the ACLU that were criticizing me about why you're reaching out to these folks and why you're reaching out to those folks. But in the end of the day, I wanted to fight for justice and get things done. And so in the, it was a thing that I was always open-eyed about what I was going into and the relationships I was building. But I feel like I have done, and we have done, some extraordinary work across the aisle on many of these issues, and a lot of folks have been brought along with more engaged common values as we've been going. And I think that that's a really important part of changing hearts and minds, so that even as we are now confronting again a serious retrenchment on these issues, at least in DC, there's a lot of allies now. There's a movement that is unstoppable in this country because of the bridge building that has been done. It's not to say that we're not without our challenges right now, but this is how you build long-term reform and change and ensure that it is sustainable even in the face of the Trump administration and Jeff Sessions.
By the way, if you have not, Vanita wrote a beautiful piece about ensuring that the current administration doesn't undermine the police justice reforms. Was that in the New York Times? Everybody go Google it, find it. She lays it out very clearly. But going to the governor now, because Vanita said something that was important. Because even though there are allies, we're building allies, and there's more support for this work, it's still tricky. You know, we are still a country, a nation, especially now, that responds to law and order rhetoric. You are a prosecutor, governor, you are a mayor, you have seen you've seen what crime and violence does to cities. As the chief executive of a state, as a governor, you also know the challenge that you had, I think, in terms of fighting against the rhetoric about law and order while at the same time doing very, very novel, important work on justice reform. Your Second Chance Society initiative, which decriminalized drug possession and really did a lot to make sure that people who were incarcerated were able to reintegrate into society, was a courageous move. It was a big move. Tell us how you, as a policymaker, you're not running for re-election now, but you ran before, and these are issues that constituents respond to. They're also issues that can very easily be misrepresented to constituents. So tell us how you go from being a prosecutor, a mayor, to then being the governor of Connecticut and really instituting reforms that are some of the most novel and exciting in the country.
Well, yeah, a couple of things I'd say about that. I mean, you know, I'm 61 years old. And the thing one of the things I'm proudest of is I never stopped growing. So 37 years ago, I came to New York to be a prosecutor in Brooklyn. And I tried 23 felony cases in 18 months. 4 of those were homicides. I had convictions in 22. And I can sit here today and tell you that I truly believe every one of them was guilty. We make a lot about the folks who are wrongly convicted and the terrible time that they spend in jail, and they never should, and we should never stop fighting for them. But there is this reality that the people we send to jail, in many cases because they've done something wrong, we also mistreat. And we do that at our own peril. I truly believe that it's barbaric to treat most 16-year-olds and most 17-year-olds as adults for the things that they do. Who in this room would want to publish a list of everything you did when you were 16 or 17 years old, or 18 or 19, or 20? And so I think some of this is about realizing that people make mistakes, but white people, well-off people, well-educated people, or at least the children of well-educated people, are treated very differently in our court system and in our criminal justice system. So, and I learned that in 1980 in Brooklyn, New York, at Central Booking, when I had to process the arrests that had been made on the streets of Brooklyn. And I never forgot it. And I internalized it. And I absolutely believe, and I'll say this in a broad audience, and it's being recorded, if white people had happening in their communities the things that were happening in Hispanic and black communities in Brooklyn, New York in 1980, we would have changed the system overnight. So if you're lucky enough or unlucky enough to be in the position that I eventually became in, I owed it to everybody to try to change that system. By the way, I'm not a hero. My wife is over at a table over here. She mentors a woman who was incarcerated for 20 years in connection with a homicide. We live this stuff. This stuff is part of who we are. We can all make a difference. You're doing that by being here and texting your donation, but we need more. And we also need a lot of our brothers and sisters of all of our races to understand that we can do better. When we send a young person to jail, and I will tell you this, most young people we send to jail, we send because we're frustrated with them. They're young. They've been in front of us as, I'm a judge, let's say. They've been in front of us 1, 2, now it's the 3rd time. They keep making mistakes. They're little mistakes, but we've given them 1, 2, or 3 chances, and we send them to jail. And what happens is you get an advanced degree in criminal behavior that you never, ever recover from. We can do better than that.
So this certainly comes as no surprise. I mean, you all know this. The message that we're getting from this administration, and this is what I spoke to briefly, Vanita, you talked about this in your New York Times piece. The message that we've gotten in the last 4 months is very different than the message that we were getting on criminal justice reform in the Obama administration. Have we gone backwards? How worried should we all be? I'll start with you, Pat.
Well, I hate to be the skunk at the lawn party, but the Obama administration were wimps on this issue. They didn't appear in the crack powder debate until it had already passed. Then they had the signing ceremony.
Always need a conservative to come and keep it real, right? Is that what you came here to do?
And I'd been working for 17 years trying to undo the injustice of the crack powder disparity. And again, the Obama administration was AWOL until we got it passed bipartisanly. One of the co-sponsors of the reform was Jefferson Sessions. Okay, now, I'm concerned about some of his rhetoric that's coming out and concerned about the policies that evolve from it, but this is not an either-or situation where you've got the good folks and the bad folks. Frankly, we have both hands on the knife that resulted in these absurdly long sentences. And one of the problems is, from the conservative point of view, is we've criminalized too many things. We've forgotten the basics. You and I were comparing backgrounds, and as you know, I grew up on Crenshaw Boulevard for the first decade of my life, and saw the deterioration, saw the crime. And as much as the disparity, and I've been very frank about this, the racial disparity inside prison is awful, but frankly, the crime rate in our inner cities is also bad. And the mothers there on Crenshaw put their children to bed at night in the old iron, claw-leg bathtubs, swaddling clothes around them because stray bullets are coming through the walls from drive-by gang shootings.
So what happens next? Where are we now? Because I hear your point, and it's a fair one, and I think that we all might agree. The last administration was not perfect on this issue, and irrespective of who we all vote for,
what's next?
it's a big...
Right.
Please.
What's next is get back to basics. People care about things, murder, rape, robbery, arson. Okay, those things you don't need a law to tell you are bad. Okay, instead we've added so many crimes. You can commit 7 felonies a day without even realizing it. And one of the things we say is prisons are for people we're afraid of, but we're filling them with folks we're just mad at. And one of the things you guys talked about, these repeat guys, they're knuckleheads that can't follow the rules. You don't send them to prison. Newt Gingrich has said you put a small-level street dealer in a prison cell with a murderer, who's going to come out more like the other? Okay, we've made a tougher criminal out of that young kid. So we need to change, concentrate on the crimes that are really bad, and rehabilitate and help those that are addicted outside the prison system.
So picking up from that point, Vanita, where do you see the best opportunity to build on this work? Pat just made a great point. We can't pretend like all of the harms happen in one administration and all the great things happen in another. Given where we are right now, and from your vantage point, where do we go next? Is the best opportunity to say, hey, we're over-criminalizing too much stuff? What do you think what's your view about what we do next?
Well, I want to agree with Pat that I think the feds were actually quite late to the game in a lot of ways, and it wasn't until 2013 that Attorney General Holder issued the Smart on Crime Initiative, and really a lot of the federal criminal justice reform kind of followed from that step, but that was several years into that administration. And there's James Foreman has come out with an extraordinary book that I would urge everyone to read about the kind of the years of Democrats and Black elected officials' involvement in the buildup of mass incarceration, which I think is a very important part of this history. Mass incarceration did take many years to build up, and there was never going to be there's no single administration that's going to be able to undo it. But that said, I do think that there was extraordinary kind of pivoting and learning from the states that were really leading the charge, and Pat was very deeply engaged in those fights around the country. The governor has been very involved in those fights. The federal government was learning from the states in the last administration, and it took time. That said, I think that we are in a state right now where this attorney general is using a lot of language that is very fear-mongering, that is invoking, literally taking us back into the 1980s, some would say the 1950s, on criminal justice policy, and its effect is not just symbolic, because the Justice Department has an enormous impact through the dollars that it gives out to state and local governments. It's how they're doing it on sanctuary cities right now, to really influence policy priorities and criminal justice at the state and local level. It also has an incredible bully pulpit. And so to the extent that there was pressure being brought to bear by federal officials and the president and former attorney generals about these issues later, you're right, that is now very much endangered. That said, what I have really come to believe, because the states have always been leading the way, is that we need to be able to push back. We need leaders like Pat, like Grover, like other folks, faith leaders, unusual allies, folks in law enforcement that are going to stand up to the fear-mongering that's happening in DC, but also to really focus on what's happening at state and local criminal justice systems, where there is such extraordinary leadership, red, purple, blue, from governors to local mayors and really through organizing and strategic work and through the grassroots movements, because I've got to say, a lot of what happened also in the Obama administration and certainly around policing was that issue was forced, the issue of police reform was forced to the forefront because people were taking to the streets and saying they will not take this anymore. And the power of grassroots protest and organizing has been an extraordinarily impactful thing, and I don't think that will go away. But the key is to make sure that there is a multifaceted effort that is helping to keep the momentum alive at the state and local level. Organizations like Vera have been helping to make that happen for a very long time, and to be able to foster that and keep that alive even while pushing back against the dangerous retrenchment that can come from DC.
So we're going to have to end shortly, and I'll conclude with you, Governor. In terms of that pushback, and your Second Chat in Society initiative has really been a model example of what justice reform means. How do you, I mean, you're a policymaker, you've had to play the political game. How do you push back, and how do we all push back against a law and order rhetoric that in some ways, I think, as Pat and Vanita have pointed out, it's empty. It's not making us safer. How do we push back against that? What's our response?
So a couple things I'd say quickly. It costs $168 a night for us to keep a person in jail in Connecticut. And tonight we'll have somewhere between 350 and 450 people who are in jail on bail that could be set for as little as $1 to $2,000. It's an equation that makes no sense at all, particularly when you understand that as little as 3 days of incarceration will separate you from your job, where you live, if you're single room occupancy, and your support network. So we have to change that. And by the way, why I started with telling you how much it cost is because there's an economic interest here. And it's compounded by the fact that when we break that relationship of that individual with a job, they are far more likely to recommit a crime, not because they want to, but because they have to, because they're hungry, or they have no place to go, and they have to sleep someplace. The economics, the destructive economics that we followed in the 90s and in the 2000s, and in all honesty, until relatively recently, can in fact be undone by an economy that is slow growth and predicts to be slow growth for a long period of time. And that may not be a happy thing that we have slow growth, but the economic pressure on doing things differently and more effectively and lowering recidivism, because we have smart programs that understand that most crimes are committed by people who are mentally ill or addicted, and addiction is a mental illness, then that's why we're going to win. That's why we're going to make progress. And then when you understand the profound disparity between black and brown and white people in this system, or between poor or people who are not well educated, then if you believe in God and you go to a church, then you can't stand by and tolerate that much longer. There are reasons to win this argument, and they're all the right reasons. They're economics, they're moral, they're about who we are and what we are as Americans. And so quite frankly, what we have to do is start speaking a different language. One that's based not on correcting the ills of the past, but understanding that people make mistakes. And we have better ways of dealing with them. And that's the argument that will win. Because there's no one in this room who's telling the truth, who would say that they didn't make a mistake, that if someone was looking, or someone knew, or someone didn't come to the defense of, might not have ended up with you being in a very different position. And so if we extend that same understanding and that same desire to prevent the initial contact, or the second contact, or the third contact, if we get away from the idea that we send people to jail because we're frustrated with their mental illness, then we're a better and a richer society. It costs a lot less on a long-term basis to solve a problem than to punish a problem.
There you go.
So I think they're making us end now. I could go on for much longer. Unfortunately, we cannot, but I cannot thank you enough. Pat, Vanita, Governor, this has been an incredible conversation. Please, another round of applause for our honorees.